Okay. Thank you very much, Mattia. It's a pleasure to be here tonight and to introduce Gideon Manning to our guest and to the participant of this seminar. Gideon Manning is a great friend of mine and great scholar. He's a research associate professor at Claremont Graduate University, and he splits his time between early modern studies, Claremont, the program in the history of medicine, and the Cedars-Sinai Medical Center, where he's a visiting associate professor, and the research at the Huntington Library and Gardens, where he's working on a number of projects, including an edited volume on the history of death, the changing grammar of anatomical illustrations, and the cat's reception history. Gideon Manning holds a PhD in philosophy from the University of Chicago. He previously taught at the University of Pittsburgh and served on the faculty at the College of William and Mary at the California Institute of Technology. In 2013, he was the recipient of a New Directions Fellowship from the Andrew Mellon Foundation, allowing him to enroll as a medical student at the Keck School of Medicine of the University of Southern California, where he gained specialized training that now he applies in his scholarship and teaching. Initially trained as a historian of philosophy and science, Gideon Manning has complementary interests in European intellectual, social, and cultural history. His research focuses primarily on the history and philosophy of medical and scientific ideas and practices, with particular emphasis on the changing conceptions of the human and the animal body, life, death, health, explanation, and nature during the early modern period, and the rise of experimentation and mechanism as they relate to these concepts. He is similarly interested in historiographical questions and the long reception of the early modern period, especially in recent philosophy, medicine, and popular culture. His earliest work addressed the 17th century natural philosopher and mathematician René Descartes. But increasingly, he has turned first to Descartes' transnational reception, how later 17th century Cartesians saw themselves as in relation and path of Descartes, and how they defined the Cartesian legacy, and second, to recovering the importance of medicine to early modern philosophy and science as vehicle for expanding the sources and voices included in the historical scholarship surrounding the so-called scientific revolution. Manning's areas of specialization span early modern philosophy, the history of medicine, and the life sciences, medical humanities, and also contemporary bioethics. Manning is a past associate editor of Opus, the Journal of the International Society for the History of Philosophy and Science, and currently edits the medicine section for the Springer Online Encyclopedia of Early Modern Philosophy and Science, while also serving as the book review editor for Annals of Science. Gideon Manning has a very particular and interesting relation with Italy. He also speaks a little, not a little, he also speaks very correctly Italian, but he has a very important article on Descartes and the Bologna Heifer that was published in the British Journal for the History of Science in 2014, where Manning made a very important discovery, that is the invitation that Descartes received in 1633 to fill a chair in the theoretical medicine at the University of Bologna. I think that no one can so interesting to be listened as Gideon Manning in our seminar. And he has also a very important chapter devoted to Descartes and Medicine, the Oxford Handbook for Descartes and Cartesianism, edited by Stephen Nedler in 2019. Also, he co-edited with Elisa Jardine Testimonies, States of Mind and States of Body in the Early Modern Period, forthcoming, I think, still for Springer. I think I say a lot, but not enough, and I'm leaving him the word. Thank you, Gideon, to be here.
Thank you very much, Igor. That was really lovely. I feel like there's nothing I can possibly do to live up to that introduction. So let me begin by first sharing my screen and making sure it's all set. Can people see it?
Yep, pretty well.
Thank you, Mattia. All right. And there we go.
Okay, now we can see it at full screen.
All right. As one of the final speakers of the seminar series, I'm honored to be able to thank Igor and all those who have made the series possible, both in Italy and France and elsewhere. For the international speakers have all taught me a great deal. So again, many thanks, and many thanks for the invitation to speak today. Descartes' most notable early modern biographer, Baillet, assigns a motto to Descartes included with the beautiful engraving here on the slide. He has lived well who has hidden well. Interesting though the motto is, and consistent with several things Descartes wrote over the course of his life describing his strategy of life, I'm interested less in what is meant explicitly by the motto that Descartes chose to remove himself from the world and conflicts to be found there, than in the motto's source, the Roman poet Ovid. Baillet did not make up this association between Ovid and Descartes. It comes from a 1634 letter Descartes wrote to his longtime friend and supporter, Father Médecine. My desire to live in peace and to continue the life that I have begun by adopting the motto, "He has lived well, who has hidden well," means that I would prefer to rid myself of my fear of attracting more attention than I want, and so on. Now, here you can see Descartes explicitly claims the motto as his own. And he was actually not alone in doing so, for the motto is also incorporated by Terentius into one of his paintings, as Hal Cook points out in his book about the young Descartes. Interested as I am in the source of the motto, you can see Descartes, again, nowhere mentions, just as Baillet did, that the source is Ovid, and he surely wouldn't have needed to for Médecine. Both he and Médecine were educated at the Jesuit College of La Flèche, where their first 4 years would have been spent studying Latin and Greek. Aside from learning grammar, students were trained in rhetoric and in reading and writing poetry in Latin and Greek. Descartes would later praise poetic inspiration and confess to still writing poetry as late as the 1640s. At La Flèche, authors he would have read and whose work he would have been exposed to and expected to model included the likes of Hesiod, Pindar, Livy, Ovid, and Virgil. Thus, Descartes and Médecine unquestionably encountered Ovid during their time at La Flèche. And more than Ovid's Tristia, they would have certainly also known and read Ovid's Metamorphoses, the great poet's account of our changing world. And this means Descartes would have known about Ovid's creation story and the initial golden age of humanity, as well as its moral and physical decline. So I've sort of destroyed the poetic feel of the relevant passages here, but again, golden age, first age, with heart and soul obedient to the law, gave honor to good faith and righteousness. Men were content with nature's food and force. Then the golden age is followed by the silver age of man, which is then followed by the Bronze Age, and then finally the Iron Age, which again is followed by Jove flooding the world, humanity and species emerging from the earth at the end. The idea of a past golden age, now lost, was widely discussed in the 16th and 17th century. And sometimes
Professor Manning, excuse me, but there is a problem with your microphone. We can hear a noise that now the problem is solved. I
okay,
believe.
sorry. I think it's the papers that were scratching you.
Okay.
Sorry about that, everybody. So anyway, so back to the thread of things. So the idea of a past golden age now lost was widely discussed in the 16th and 17th centuries, and it was actually sometimes even used in scientific polemic with respect to the human body. Reading from Sylvius here, many testimonies in both sacred and profane literature plainly convince one that the lifespan of the ancients was also longer than that of people in our own time. Indeed, the internal parts differ in size, number, and shape in different parts of the world, and both the writings of the ancients and our bodies abundantly testify that the same things that the ancients observed are not still found in all our bodies. Here in this passage, Sylvius is responding to Andreas Vesalius, who in 1543 had identified errors in Galen's human anatomy. And this passage specifically is related to the number of bones in the sternum. Galen said 7, Vesalius found only 6. On Galen's behalf, though, Sylvius would have us believe that our bodies have simply changed since antiquity. Ancient people were stronger, healthier, and longer lived than we are today. And this goes hand in hand with a view that humans in antiquity could have been giants, unlike today, but also that the world itself has suffered certain de-evolution as well. So there are, for example, new ailments, new diseases that are emerging in later periods that didn't exist in earlier ones. We have simply devolved them, and sources, both sacred and profane, attest to this change. St. Augustine's reflections on Adam and Eve and the Garden of Eden offer further evidence for our decline. In paradise, writes Augustine, then man lived as he desired so long as he desired what God had commanded. He lived in the enjoyment of God and was good by God's goodness. He lived without any want and had it in his power so to live eternally. He had food that he might not hunger, drink that he might not thirst, the tree of life that old age might not waste him. There was in his body no corruption, nor seed of corruption, and so on. And in fact, Augustine formulated 3 essential questions which would engage theologians about the story of creation for some time, well, certainly into the 17th century. How is it that the animate body is capable of immortality? So the animate as opposed to the spiritual body. What is the nature of Adam's immortality? And how can one define and explain the physical effect of the tree of life? No one could read Genesis in the Christian tradition, or the early church fathers' reflections on Genesis, and miss the fact that those living before the flood lived to be unusually old. Adam lived to be 930 years old, Seth to 912, Methuselah to 969, and the list goes on. Excluding Noah, who lived to be 950 years old, after the flood, people's lifespan continued to decline to the psalmist expectation of 70, or 70 years. An awareness of the long life of the patriarchs predates Augustine and isn't simply limited to sacred texts or commentaries on sacred texts. For the first and probably only time in my academic career, I'm going to be quoting Josephus. Noah died having lived the number of 950 years, writes Josephus. But let no one, upon comparing the lives of the ancients and our lives, and with the few years which we now live, think that we have said to them what we have said to them is false, or make the shortness of our lives at present an argument that neither did they retain to so long a duration of life. And you'll notice, by the way, that Josephus continues in his Jewish antiquities by citing a number of non-sacred historians, including Hellenistic authors writing in Greek, such as Manetho's Egyptian History. So what does all this have to do with Descartes? Well, when we consider Descartes, or for that matter, any early modern figure who addresses themselves to the human lifespan and the prospect of extending the years of our lives, we must remember that they are drawing on ideas that were pervasive in learned culture at the time and present in sacred texts and reported by secular authorities alike. I've chosen my topic and begun with these remarks for two primary reasons. First, I have for a long time been bothered, I might even say annoyed, by the way longevity has been treated by historians of philosophy and science and those who discuss Descartes. It's been ignored, ridiculed, or mentioned only in passing, and I'm uncomfortable with these choices. As I've just indicated, when Descartes shows interest in longevity, he is connecting with a diverse tradition of serious theological, medical, and philosophical reflection about the causes of aging, death, and longevity. My second reason for choosing to focus on longevity relates to the topics of the seminar series as a whole, medicine and morality. For in medicine, longevity is a natural complement to the hygiene and regimen Descartes seeks to develop. While in morals, longevity is a goal supported by the sober love of life Descartes' moral philosophy is supposed to engender. If life is worth living, then it's worth sustaining and extending. Beyond these reasons, I've come to believe that longevity provides a window into a number of topics that arise during the Cartesian era and also relate to his reception. We might ask, does philosophy remain a way of life in the early modern period? And in Descartes' case, what are philosophy's practical aims? Longevity has a role here. How should we characterize Descartes' project in relation to previous traditions? I think this one's a bit more complicated, but here again, Descartes is responding to a view of the human body and its decline since antiquity. Further, Descartes was not prone to underestimate himself, as we all know, or to easily acknowledge errors or failures. But that is what he appears to do here, as we will see in the case of increasing longevity or lifespan. He acknowledges he's failed to achieve anything. What can this acknowledged failure then tell us about his philosophical project and development and the way he maneuvers failure? Further, Descartes' religious orthodoxy is also potentially at stake in the case of longevity. The age of the patriarchs was in some quarters given a natural and medicalized cause, but Thomas assigned Adam's long life primarily to God's grace, as did Augustine. Interest in longevity and extending life pressed against theological claims emphasizing the transience of life and the value of earthly suffering in preparation for salvation. I won't be able to fully address these questions today. We can return to them in the Q&A period. But if there's one lesson I wish to convey, it's that Descartes' hope to extend human life should not be dismissed as of secondary interest to him or to those around him. Put another way, longevity matters and warrants at least 30 more minutes of your time. So what does this talk about? So I'm going to break it up roughly into three parts. First, I'm going to return to Descartes' interest in medicine and longevity in particular to substantiate longevity's role within his mature development. And in this case, I'm going to also tie it to his biography. After this, I'm going to turn attention to the ways in which Descartes understood the aging process and the prospects of increasing the human lifespan. Right? So there are specific physiological stories he has to tell about the way in which we age from childhood into old age. And then finally, I'm going to reflect ever so briefly on what Descartes did when he realized he had had very little success in devising a regimen that would delay death. So I've already indicated that there was good reason for Descartes to consider longevity as a serious topic. Even so, there are more mundane reasons we should acknowledge. In Descartes' France, as the historian of medicine Andrew Weir reminds us, around a quarter of live births dead before their first year. Half a generation dead before the 15th year. A life expectancy of 20 or 30 years. Not only was death an ever-present shadow for individuals and families, but communities could be collectively traumatized. The three arrows of God, pestilence, famine, and war, recurred in brief cycles, often feeding upon each other. When one did not kill, it prepared the ground for one of the others. So, for example, war could produce famine, and famine left people open to death from endemic and epidemic diseases. These short-term mortality crises effectively kept population growth to a very low level by culling local areas of their population. In such a world, knowledge about health and illness was, in the minds of people of the time, surely an urgent matter giving hope to survival. And it was surely this for Descartes too. It also helped, perhaps, to produce the feeling of personal control over events by making sense of how illness and death occurred and by providing instructions on how to lead a healthy life in the pursuit of longevity. Descartes' own interest in medicine and longevity spans some 20 years. This fact lies in plain sight for those of us willing to look, and many here at the talk today have looked and recognize as much. In January 1630, at the age of 34, Descartes writes to Médecine, concerned not about his own health, but about Mércine's. I'm distressed over your erysipelas and over the illness of an unnamed figure. I beg you to preserve yourself, at least until I can determine whether there is a way to find a medicine founded on infallible demonstrations, which is what I now seek. And again, on April 15th of that year, Descartes commits himself to studying chemistry and anatomy together. Many of you will also remember the the concluding paragraph of the Discourse on Method from 1637, where he says that he's resolved to devote the rest of his life to nothing other than trying to acquire some knowledge of nature from which we may derive rules in medicine which are more reliable than those we have had up to now. And those are rules for a regimen, for a hygiene. And of course, writing to the Marquis of Newcastle in October 1645, he says that the preservation of health, what hygiene is all about, has always been the principal end of my studies, if not slight overstatement, certainly central to some of the views he's expressed already. Now, similar attestations are to be found elsewhere in Descartes' correspondence and published work. As for longevity, though, Descartes first begins to raise the issue and to remark about his own health in the mid-1630s. In a letter to Huygens, following the death of Huygens' wife Susanna in the summer of 1637, Descartes writes that white hairs are rapidly appearing on my head, warning me that the only thing I should be studying is ways of delaying them. And traditionally, the graying of the hair was associated with the drying of the body. That is what I am now doing. This task takes up so much of my time that I have resolved to concentrate on this alone. Shortly afterwards, and these are images of Huygens and his wife, shortly afterwards, in December, Descartes again would write to Huygens, indicating I have never taken so much care to preserve myself than I am doing now. Whereas I used to think that death could deprive me of no more than 30 or 40 years at the most, I would not now be surprised if the deprivation could amount to more than a century. I think I see with certainty that if only we guard ourselves against certain errors that we habitually make in the way we live, we shall be able to reach without further discovery a much longer and happier old age than we otherwise would. Extending his life is clearly what Descartes was focused on in 1637, consistent with his published remarks in the Discourse that same year. And a hygiene, a strategy for preserving our life, was the way to do this. The next 3 years, from 1637 to 1640, Descartes endured the deaths of several people close to him, including Henricius Reneri in 1639 and his daughter Francine Descartes in 1640. Just a few months before Reneri's death, Descartes can still be found writing to Médecine with optimism. He writes that during the last 30 years, I have not had any illness which could properly be called serious. I have acquired a little knowledge of medicine, one of these more modest moments for Descartes, and I feel very well and look after myself with as much care as a rich man with gout. For these reasons, I'm inclined to think that I am now further from death than I ever was in my youth, and should God not grant me the knowledge to avoid the discomforts of old age, I hope he will at least grant me a long enough life and the leisure to endure them. Now, toward the end of this passage here, Descartes appears to be hedging a little about the possible success of extending life. It all depends on providence, after all. So at most, we can only assure, I think, that we live as long as God has decreed, avoiding an accidental, or what in the 18th century would come to be called a sudden death, is the best we might be able to do. And further, whatever our investment in our lives, however much we love life, we must not love life so much that its loss leads us to fear death. Loving life and not fearing death is the needle, Descartes indicating at the end of this letter, is the needle he wishes to thread. And this issue will return a decade later. Descartes' hedging, however, soon gave way to a more significant change of tone. Reneri died in March 1639, and by June, Descartes was acknowledging, as for death, I'm well aware that it may take me by surprise at any moment. Yet by the grace of God, my teeth are still so firm, a sign of youth, and strong, that I do not think I need fear death for another 30 years. So here, Descartes is no longer thinking in terms of 100 years or more. Descartes is now thinking of living into his 70s, the limit suggested by some passages from the Bible, from Psalms in particular. Just a few months later, in December, Descartes also shared with Huygens that he now bore a common mark of old age, deafness. These changes in tone suggest to me, at least, a deeper meaning to a remark in the opening paragraph of Descartes' Meditations, published just 2 years later, 2 years, that is, after these passages here. So I'm not going to read this whole thing. Many of you probably already know this by heart. But if you go to the colored passage, but the task looked an enormous one, and I began to wait until I could reach a mature enough age to ensure that no subsequent time of life would be more suitable for tackling such inquiries, which suggests you need to accrue a certain amount of wisdom before you can engage in the kind of project Descartes describes in the Meditations in Meditation 1. He continues, this led me to put the project off for so long that I would now be to blame if by pondering over it any further, I wasted the time still left for carrying it out. Having recognized new signs of old age during the period in which he was writing the Meditations, white hair and deafness, Perhaps Descartes recognized he needed to demolish everything completely and start again right from the foundation, because his time to do so was running out. Now, I can't leave this passage without offering one further remark about it. So Descartes is often, well, criticized or at least characterized as having very little practical interest. That is, interest in the activities and the realities of everyday life when you look just at the meditations. Here in this initial passage, for example, he describes withdrawing from the world. And of course, this withdrawing from the world involves a spiritual exercise, which is an internal exercise. Contrast this with the kind of methodological strategy adopted by someone like Bacon, which Kant, in the second edition of the Critique of Pure Reason, also recognizes when he picks an epigraph from Bacon to add to the beginning of the work. The idea being that someone like Bacon engages with the world in a collective enterprise, whereas Descartes doesn't do that. He withdraws internally. But of course, all this interest in longevity suggests something very different. It suggests a serious engagement with the world and a serious practical interest and implication for his natural science. Descartes, of course, would be dead, however, 9 years after the publications of the Meditations. But the thought that he had discovered the secret to a long life, a very long life, persisted. The English Catholic Kenelm Digby, who knew Descartes in the 1630s during the latter's most optimistic period, reported that although to render man immortal is what he, Descartes, would not dare to hope for, he was quite sure of being able to render his life equal to that of the patriarchs. So as we saw, that's about 1,000 years, which we saw also, though, that in his private correspondence, Descartes backed away from that idea already in the late 1630s. And when news of Descartes' death reached the Abbé Picot, he responded in disbelief, convinced that in the absence of such an alien and violent cause as the unhealthy weather of the north, he, Descartes, would have lived 500 years after having discovered the art of living several centuries. The art of living several centuries was claimed by more than a few others in the Renaissance and early modern period. Paracelsus is another example who comes to mind. But Descartes' investment in the effort had lasted for many years of his own development, and it continued to be associated with Descartes even after his death. Part of the reason for this is surely the central place given to medicine in his project and the emphasis in the discourse on method to the practical implications of the new science he was developing. Few here in the audience will need reminding of the tree of philosophy Descartes references in the letter preface to the French edition of the Principles of Philosophy. The branches, of course, emerging from the trunk of physics with its roots in metaphysics, issue in 3 basic sciences, or fundamental sciences: medicine, mechanics, and morals. Now, as Dan Garber has pointed out, though each part of the tree of the true philosophy is supposed to grow out of the previous part, it's not entirely clear how this metaphor is to be cashed out. And there are obviously things missing, like mathematics, or in a more complicated way, something I've written about myself, as have others, where we associate the union between mind and body in this account is also somewhat complex. Indeed, it's not always easy to make precise how the parts of the true philosophy that Descartes is outlining are related to one another. In the case of hygiene and the goal of longevity, it's with the 1664 posthumous publication of Descartes' Treatise on Man and description of the human body that his account of the physiological process of aging is finally publicly available. That is to say, the link between physics and medicine seems to finally be made for people. So now I'm transitioning to the second part of my talk. In the Orthodox medical tradition, the process of corruption and death was fairly well understood, though there's some inconsistency to be found in the Hippocratic tradition, where the text regimen identifies aging and old age with being cold and wet. The dominant view by the time Descartes was alive and writing would have been that advanced by Aristotle and Galen, that aging involves growing cold and dry. But let me give you some further details about this. So the physician's account of corruption and death breaks down essentially into two phenomenon, two natural or medicalized phenomenon. A slow consumption of the radical moisture, that is the fuel of the body, by the natural heat of the body, and related, a weakening of the natural heat over time due to consumption of our fuel, our radical moisture, and then the accumulation of the wrong kind of moisture in the body, a nutritional moisture. In the Orthodox medical tradition, the process of corruption and death was, as I said, fairly well understood. With ideas deriving from Aristotle and Galen, I've already mentioned these two factors, but heat and, at least after the Middle Ages, radical moisture would have been necessary parts of the story. The ages of men were also explained by a process of the body drying up. So there's some dispute about how many ages human beings have. Ptolemy in the Tetrabiblos identifies 7, but a more common number would be 4, similar to the seasons of the year. If we look at Avicenna here, so this is a long passage, but I think it conveys quite a bit to us, we find an influential touchstone for many of the later discussions. And so remember those two factors I mentioned earlier, as well as this idea that we grow cold and dry as we age. So innate heat begins to decline after middle age, roughly a little bit before my age right now, so in our 30s. Moisture must come to an end and the innate heat become extinguished. It may be summarized that both children and the young are balanced in regard to heat, while the middle-aged and senile are relatively cold. Children possess a moderate excess of moisture to fulfill the requirements of growth, right? So they burn extra to grow. The excess of moisture in children is evident from the softness of their bones. And keep this passage in mind, or at least this idea, for when we get to Descartes in a moment. The middle-aged and the old are not only cold, but dry. This can be observed from their bones being hard and their skin dry. But of course, Avicenna wrote quite some time before Descartes, and although Plempius attempted the last early modern extended commentary on Avicenna's canon, likely implying that Descartes would have been at least a little bit familiar with some of the ideas there, a 17th century physician whose views would have been more widely disseminated in the early modern period similarly wrote about these issues. Innate heat begins, wrong passage. Our life is founded on two supports, namely natural heat, which is the principal instrument of the soul, and radical moisture, which serves as its nourishment. Just as oil nourishes the flame of a lamp, a very common metaphor in the period and much earlier as well. Our heat weakens every day. It cannot repair what is lost, so nutrition can't replace that radical moisture that we're born with. Although, as it turns out, the tree of life could for Adam. Our heat weakens every day, cannot repair what is lost to the same degree of perfection. And as our heat consumes the radical moisture, it extinguishes itself in the end. For Descartes' part, he doesn't quite agree with these accounts, although he will assign an important role to heat as a principle of life, as Annie has written so magnificently about. The physiological account of aging that he provides, that is Descartes, has more to do with hardening and what might be called petrification. So I mentioned already, in 1664, finally the Treatise on Man and the Description of the Human Body present to the world Descartes' account of aging. And this is what he writes. So you'll all recall that in the Treatise on Man, Descartes is supposing the existence of a machine very much like our body, with all the parts needed or necessary to produce the effects we observe in our own bodies. And here he's talking about growth and aging. Now, if our machine represents the body of an infant, its matter will be so tender, and recall Avicenna's view about the softness of the tissue of a baby, will be so tender, and its pores so easily enlarged, that the parts of the blood that enter in this way into the composition of its solid parts will usually be a little larger than those which they replace, right? So you have to imagine these kind of tubes or tunnels, channels, where the blood with nutrients flow through. And, you know, something a little too big for the channel can push its way through and make it to the end, to its location, where it will be added to the body. But the matter of its parts, he goes on, will gradually harden in the meantime, so that after a few years, its pores will no longer be able to enlarge to the same degree, right? So you'll start to get things that can make it through, but not the biggest things anymore. And so this body, ceasing to grow, they will represent the body of an older person, right? Hardened, you might say in the earlier tradition, dried up. Now, death is not mentioned here in this passage from the Treatise on Man, but the idea of aging and growth sets the constraint on what natural death will be. Nourishment, the source of the body's growth and presumably of life itself, is less effective at sustaining the body over time, owing to the natural hardening of the body in the course of its life. Anyone who thinks Descartes' machine of the body, by the way, is best represented by a kinematics of rigid bodies is obviously mistaken by when you look at passages like this. At least before death and before all the serious hardening, it's all about fluid mechanics and flowing parts. And this point is also made in the description of the human body, where all the parts, including death, are put together. And as we get older, writes Descartes, the filaments making up the solid parts tighten and stick together more closely, finally attaining such a degree of hardness that the body ceases entirely to grow and even loses its capacity for nourishment. This leads to such an imbalance between the solid and the fluid parts that age alone puts an end to life. And of course, old age until the late 20th century was still often used as an indication of a cause of death. So again, old age is a cause of death here. The hard parts of the body can no longer be replenished or sustained. This process, as represented in the treatise and description, is inevitable, a consequence of growth and normal maturation. It can presumably be delayed, but it's not clear whether it can be reversed. And you'll have noticed by now that I haven't spent a great deal of time discussing the details of Descartes' regimen. And part of the reason for that is there's not a great deal that's original there. It's really all about moderation, a theme that goes all the way back to antiquity and extends into the 18th century as well. By 1646, Descartes' early optimism about extending life had almost, if not entirely, waned. And now I move to the final bit of my talk. So I'm almost done. He had assumed the role of medical advisor to Elizabeth of Bohemia, and as in so many matters, her challenging questions had pushed him in a slightly different direction. But there were independent reasons for Descartes to start thinking about moral philosophy. In a letter to Chanot, we find Descartes conceding his dashed hopes about longevity. So jumping to the colored parts. What little knowledge of physics I have tried to acquire has been a great help to me in establishing sure foundations in moral philosophy. And recall, again, the tree of the true philosophy from the letter preface to the Principles. Indeed, I have found it easier to reach satisfactory conclusions on this topic than on many others concerning medicine, on which I have spent much more time. So instead of finding ways to preserve life, I have found another, much easier and surer way, which is not to fear death, which is, again, that same refrain we first find in the letter to Médecine from the 1639. Descartes may have given up on extending life beyond its natural limits, but the influence of his ideas, and even his idea of artificially extending the life of the body machine, are still with us. And we've all, to some extent, I guess, benefited from that strategy. Later in the 17th century, his ambitions were ridiculed by his critics, not least, although maybe not quite a critic, by Queen Christina, who, when Descartes died in 1650, quipped, "His oracles quite deceived him." But this is hardly a good motto for Descartes, and I don't wish to end here. Instead, I'd like to end where I began, with Ovid, and with what might be a more fitting thought for Descartes. My fame shall live to all eternity, or at least until June 3rd, 2021. Thanks very much, everybody.
Thank you very much, Gideon, for this wonderful conference. I think that it was just beautiful. And now I leave the word to Mattia to open the debate. I think that there are already some questions ready for Gideon. But please, Mattia.
Perfetto, allora indico soltanto la modalità di prenotazione, anche se vedo che ci sono già delle prenotazioni, quindi possiamo già dare la parola ai primi partecipanti per le domande. Quindi bisogna semplicemente utilizzare la funzione della mano, come si è fatto anche negli incontri precedenti, quindi vi verrà data la parola nell'ordine di prenotazione. Quindi inizierei dal dottor Baldassarri, che può attivare sia la webcam che il microfono e porre le domande.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you, Gideon. It was really fascinating as usual. I totally agree with you. I mean, I think that nutrition plays a crucial role in Descartes, at least to fill some of the gaps of his medicine in a way. So when you are speaking of death by the issues of death is strictly connected to the nutrient to the movement of the nutrient parts in the body. So your reference to l'homme and to la description du corps humain is perfect. I just wanted to mention that a similar passage is also in the Excerpta Anatomica, in a note entitled On a Creation and Nutrition. So it is even more interesting in this way. And I also wanted to highlight one point that because there is a slightly difference between l'homme and la description du corps humain, because in the second text Descartes claims that also the thickening of parts is crucial in this process of death, so to speak. So right. I mean, this is important as well.
Yeah, no, I agree. And I mean, you've obviously, Fabio, been writing about these issues and nutrition in particular as an entry point into Descartes' medicine. And if anything, I think I probably, before thinking through this talk, underestimated the significance of nutrition, right? So, you know, we tend to focus when we ask ourselves about life and death in Descartes simply on the fire in the heart. And that's going to be a part of the story, but it's, in a way, it's sort of the end of the account. It's when the vital heat in the earlier tradition, or the fire in the heart, goes out, you might say, that's when we lose life. But the mechanism and that process of extinguishing the fire in the heart, it's intimately tied to two things, to nutrition, as you mentioned, and I think, again, that's drawing on the more orthodox medical tradition or physiological thought, but also that natural process he identifies of hardening, thickening, And again, he, like everybody else, has to tell a story about the ages of human beings, even if we don't give them specific ages, of childhood, where we do grow, until our late 20s, maybe, or mid 20s. Although I'm growing in different ways during this pandemic, but that's a different story, right? And then although that actually is part of the story for Descartes too, I will say, I think I've answered your question. Probably I was just going to make a joke about when I was reading some of these regimen books. One of my favorite bits of advice was a physician who draws an analogy to the long life of plants and trees in particular. And he points out that, well, why do they live so long? Because they don't move. So the best advice is to lead an entirely sedentary life, and you will live a very long time. Obviously bad advice, but there's a certain rationale to it. Thanks, Fabri.
Thank you very much.
Ok, adesso la domanda di Daniel Garber, che può, ok, attivare. E anche la webcam se lo desidera. Perfetto.
I can hear
you. Can hear me now.
Perfect.
Thank you for letting me speak. That was wonderful. But I'm wondering, there are a couple of things that I want to relate to your talk. My sense is that the idea of extending life is not a major theme in the actual writings on medicine that Descartes left. Although what is extremely interesting is it becomes a major theme, I think, after Descartes' death, and the myth that at the moment that Descartes died, or at the time Descartes died, he had announced to somebody that he had a major discovery. Of course, this leading to Father Daniel's fantasy. Right. Somewhat later.
Yes, no, that's right. Where, okay, so continue, Dan, but yes.
But what I'm actually wondering about is another contemporary who was also concerned with life and death, and whose work was also read for the light that it could shed on extending life, and that, of course, is Francis Bacon.
Absolutely.
Whose Historia Vitae et Mortis was published, of course, in 1623, while Descartes was still young and probably before he himself had started work on that. And I'm wondering if you could say something, been working on Bacon for these last few years, about the relationship between Bacon and Descartes on this question. Yeah, well, obviously Bacon had no knowledge of Descartes, but Descartes' knowledge of Bacon's work on this, and the way in which the two of them interacted later after Descartes' death, when people were concerned with this question.
Okay, so you're really teeing me up here, Dan. All right, so let me begin by the first bit. So extending life not being among the major elements of Descartes' surviving corpus. That is, so there, I've effectively introduced just about all the comments you're going to find, but there's not that sustained, discussion. So two things I guess I want to say about that. The first is, it's true that it's not explicitly stated, like, today I'm working on longevity. All these remarks here in my therapeutics are about longevity, or these regimens that I'm introducing are not about longevity. However, when we find him, talking about moderation. So, for example, there's a bit in Baillet where he's remarking about Descartes' strategy of never drinking more wine than it was good for him, effectively, like that he could handle, I think is the turn of phrase. I forget the French, right? All of those remarks belong within the hygiene that Descartes is trying to develop, or the regimen. And that is in the service not just of preserving health in this period, but also of longevity. Okay, so I think there's probably a bigger window in the surviving corpus related to this topic than an explicit mention of it would necessarily suggest, right? So you have to look a little bit bigger. And I do think that it appears at these key moments where he's characterizing his interests, especially these really intimate moments, not just in consoling a friend, but in identifying, as all of us eventually do, wow, I have a few more grays, I'm losing a little bit here, you know, I'm thickening in the way that Descartes talks about in the description. And those kinds of moments in our lives, as Descartes is a human like the rest of us, cause a bit of extra reflection on these issues. And I think that's true of Descartes as well. Now, to your second point about it becoming a major issue after his death, I completely agree. And I think in some ways, that's also entirely understandable, right? So one of the questions I intimated at early in my remarks about why I'm interested in longevity is that it does become a big deal, but it's also one of these instances where Descartes acknowledges an apparent failure. No greater failure than the fact that he died in 1650, right? So it becomes a stick that can be used against him, but it can do so precisely because Descartes and everybody else recognized that the rubber hit the road for the new science on these sorts of practical questions. What can you do for me today, right? So what can you do for me with respect to the pain I feel, the preserving of my health, or the extending of my life? And that actually dovetails nicely into the question about relating Descartes to Bacon. So my recollection, and I'm sure this is owing to you when I was a graduate student at Chicago, when I think you first began to take up Bacon seriously, or at least a little bit. So Descartes certainly knew de augmentum, right? Yeah.
Augmentis.
Augmentis, thank you, right? He certainly knew that. And he likely knew the Novum Organum. Whether or not he knew these other texts, I'm not certain. But in a way, that's less interesting to me, because for me, at least, what's interesting is these, as I said at the beginning, these ideas about longevity and prolonging life, these are part of the intellectual culture of the early modern period. They are common, and they shouldn't be read and dismissed as insignificant, just as people are now taking very, very seriously Bacon's reflections on these matters and the dissemination of them. We should do the same with Descartes. And that goes in both directions, as a way of criticizing and understanding their failures to follow through, but also as a way of appreciating the range of their intellectual interests and the implications of their project. Now, the last bit, very quickly, I have thought, and I'm currently trying to write something about the rhetorical and very, to my mind, anachronistic use to which Descartes is put almost immediately after his death, where Bacon is cast as a kind of hero, especially in England, and Descartes is cast as a villain. And, you know, Peter Anstey and others, when they trace this story of the emergence of the experimental philosophy and Descartes as a speculative philosopher, I can't really go very far with them on that. I think there's a more, from my mind, a more interesting and fairer account to tell about Descartes' reception. So hold tight. One day, I will have a better answer to that last bit for you.
Yeah,
guys.
just a brief follow-up. I agree with you. I think Peter Anstey's story about experimental philosophy versus speculative does describe what's going on in the Royal Society, does describe what's going on in English science, not so well for continental, with the possible exception of the Dutch.
Yes,
there was
right.
a close connection. Bacon, and what's interesting, and that might be a really interesting place to look, because of course Descartes had his followers in the Netherlands. It's very influential there, but at the same time, English science had its followers in the Netherlands.
And going in both directions. Okay, so I can't help myself. You know, one of the most interesting instances of discussion about this kind of topic emerges in a very, very difficult, but like nobody ever reads Tschirnhaus's Medicina Mentis et Corporis. People read his encounter with Spinoza in the correspondence and the stuff about metaphysics, but if you look at the Medicina Mentis et Corporis, that's the only work with both titles in it, as far as I know, of the early modern period, and it is this smorgasbord, English, continental, the sources are incredibly interesting, and in a way it's answering a question that everybody in the 17th century should have been taking very, very seriously. Namely, okay, we got this scientific revolution going, everything's great, eventually we'll have all of these great outcomes for medicine and so on. How do we live long enough to see the payoff? And that's what his Medicina et Corporis is about. So yes, absolutely, Dan, I agree.
That would be a great work. I mean, and Tschirnhaus, of course, was friend of Spinoza and a friend of Leibniz as well.
Right, absolutely, the conduit between the two, right? And even describe the ethics as a Medicina Mentis, which is still something I'm trying to get my...
And Steno as well.
Yes, absolutely.
Thank you.
Fantastic, Dan, thank you.
Allora, Leon Fine può porre la sua domanda.
Can't hear you, Leon. Sorry.
Yes. Dr. Fine, you have to activate your microphone.
Still no luck, Dan.
So we can give the possibility to Mattia Mantovani to pose his question, waiting for the microphone of Dr. Fine.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Gideon. That was insightful and elegant as usual. Just almost an anecdote to support your claim. As for the Ovid part, there is a very nice passage in Redius Cartesiomania, where he wrote, I was in Descartes' studium in Deventer. On his desk there was Kepler and Ovid. I saw no Bible there. And that was a major concern for the guy. Which brings me to my question. Since you are planning to write a history of death on a longer period, and this passage is on the very long, extremely long lives of the patriarchs, of course, were taken to be important documents in this sense. When the critique to the Bible arrived, and I don't know whether there are passages in Spinoza, I don't think so, attacking this idea, well, this is just an hoax. When the story that they're not longer taken seriously enters the picture, does it affect the sense that we can really prolong our life for so long? So how does it enter this thing? Because till Vico in Italy and beyond, you have the idea, well, this is true story. But of course, not everybody agreed on that. I strongly doubt that Hobbes was taking them seriously. And so many other authors at the time.
Right, so there wasn't time for me to include this, but Gabriel Naudet, the Catholic historian, wrote extensively about, and in response to questions about fate. So there's this, neo-Stoic view emerging out of Lipsius about, the end of our life is fated, and we have no control, we can't decide these things. And he contributes to the very same volume of Bever-Vicus's epistolary letters that Descartes eventually contributes to in the 1640s. And there, Naudet has these great arguments about how the Bible's just complete nonsense in this regard, right? So he says things like, okay, look, if they were living to 1,000 years and it's all a question of decline, well, they were only living into their 70s during the writing of Psalms, and we should only be living into our 20s now, right? So that's one argument. And then the others have to do with acknowledging our kind of that they're almost like myths, and you have to really be taken in, right? So already in the peers of Descartes, just to locate it back in connection with Descartes, are recognizing that these older stories are not necessarily to be taken seriously, right? Nevertheless, there are still, I think, serious questions about ancient knowledge, ancient regimens being more effective than our own. So people are still trying to recreate remedies that can extend life, people are still trying to reconcile evidence of life expectancy in different places on the planet, right? So the size of people, right? So this idea about the de-evolution of the body, even if you don't subscribe to the fuller account of Genesis as read in the Christian tradition, right? So in the Hebrew tradition, they point out that nowhere in Genesis is Adam said to be immortal, right? That's kind of an invention of the Christian tradition. But anyway, yeah. So even as these things decline, the issues are still taken seriously. I mean, Vicus has asked many doctors to contribute on this question, and now Day has a very negative view. But others, you know, Van Helmont, he has a very positive view about what we can do. So it doesn't quite disappear. And I don't think there's any reason to think that Descartes didn't at least take seriously the thought that our bodies may have changed and that we can reclaim something. Certainly also, just as an aside, there are, and it's, you know, anecdotal, but in almost every single one of these books of hygiene and regimen, there are anecdotal references to centenarians, these people who live over 100 years, right? So there is an idea that we can do something. And even nowadays, believes we can do something. We can be rational, live a life of moderation, take the advice of doctors, and so on. So I hope that's an answer, Mattia. I'll think about it. It's a good question.
Yep, many thanks.
Okay. Sorry.
I was going to ask if Dr. Fine has.
Dr. Fine, I imagine I can that I can guide you. The symbol of the microphone is in the central part of your screen, but I am not understanding.
Mattia, Professor Fine, perhaps if you want, you can write your question in the chat.
Dr. Fine's office is actually next to mine at Cedars-Sinai, program in the history of medicine. So I will have a chance, I hope, to talk to him in a little bit, and because I have a meeting with him shortly. So I'll have a chance to take his question and hopefully answer it then.
Send us a note about discussion.
I will. I'll show up to next week's talk, and I'll ask and answer the question for us.
Allora, credo che non ci siano ulteriori domande, quindi passerei nuovamente la parola al professor Agostini per la conclusione, immagino, a meno che non risultino delle prenotazioni dell'ultimo minuto, ma no, credo di no, quindi credo si possa concludere.
Grazie, Mattia. Thank you, Mattia. And especially thank you, Gideon, for this wonderful conference and for your constant presence in all the seminar. And even today, that everyone can go out and to walk and to have life, finally, we were 25, 26, so it was a successful conference tonight too, and I want to thank you again. I want to thank you, our guest, and just remember our last conference, which will be on Monday with the Sigrid Agostini, because her conference shifted to next Monday. So see you soon next Monday, and have a good day. Bye-bye. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, everyone, for coming. Grazie mille.
Ciao, 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 Gideon. Hello, Dan.